Go. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sarah Bratt, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Arizona School of Information. Here with me today is also Sarah Stueve, currently a PhD student at the University of Arizona. And today we'll be talking about collaborative work on what we're calling helicopter science. But there's going to be a little bit of nuance that we'll add. So this is a use of distant data sets by Global North and Global South researchers. We have worked with a wide team, some of whom are at ICSSI, and these include researchers from Fairfield University, as well as Indiana, Bloomington, and University of Arizona. Before we begin, we also want to acknowledge that science takes place. And so we would like to respectfully acknowledge that the Tohono O'odham and Yaqui peoples are the land on which our research has been done at the University of Arizona. So to kick us off, everyone here is probably familiar with this idea of data-intensive science. Now, more frequently, we see that teams are involved in the production of data-intensive science. And this is because we require expertise across various types of positions. And this is often international research. And especially with data sets, we see that international samples are at the center of a lot of that data-intensive research. From a data sample, there are connections now in the traces, the digital traces of the scientific ecosystem to papers. So this is becoming more visible. And so in this particular study, we are focusing on the role of data samples and where they're drawn from internationally and some of those dynamics of local collaboration. So here, we're focusing specifically on the kinds of collaborations that are sometimes characterized as helicopter research, also known as parachute science, colonial science, among other concepts. And the idea here is that some of the early studies have looked at the ways that researchers have used the data from countries that are not their domestic location. And sometimes there's a lack of credit given or lack of local collaboration. Now, these studies tend to focus largely on specific topic areas. And this is great because we're getting a lot of contextual information. However, many of these quantitative studies are not looking at a systematic level of the dataset locations and the author affiliations. And what is the problem with this? Well, some of that requires us to, the lack of scale prevents us from analyzing the factors that are contributing to helicopter science. And perhaps we're not able to look at the leadership roles of scientists who are there working locally. So this gap in the literature at the systematic level led us to these research questions. So first of all, we're going to ask, to what extent are data sets from the Global South used by researchers in the Global North, a type of operationalization potentially of parachute science? Second, how frequently are Global South researchers in leadership roles when they're working with Global South dataset collaborations? And from here, I will hand it over to my wonderful collaborator, Sarah Stueve.
Thanks, Sarah. We're Sarah squared up here. So I think that, so we'll start by just describing the data set. So the data that we're using to find a corpus of data set information is kind of tricky. There are a few different sources. For this particular portion of the research that we hope to continue and broaden over time, we started with the Nature Scientific Data abstracts and titles from Semantic Scholar and OpenAlex. And what we do with that is, if you could click, Sarah. You're fine. So Nature Scientific Data is an open access journal for descriptions of scientific data sets. And our sample includes 3,200 abstracts that are from 2014 to 2023. The goal of this project was to identify dataset locations and author affiliations in terms of location, to analyze the alignment of the data sample and author affiliation to operationalize a potential instance of helicopter science. So are the people who are, doing the research, are they from the same country as the data set is from? And is there a distributional difference between Global North and Global South authors on those papers? And so one tricky thing about this, though, is that language can be very challenging, right? It can be difficult to assess location from text. So for example, we have this very super broad location example here, which is very imprecise of like Pacific latitudinal gradient. What does that mean, right? And so that would be hard to identify. There's no country level identification there, but even so, it's an important, like, this is the kind of problem we can see. So to do this, to solve this problem, we used Refined, which is an LLM, a large language model from Amazon Science. It's based on the transformer architecture. So we've all heard of ChatGPT. It's like ChatGPT, but also not at all like ChatGPT in the sense that it's not generative. It basically is trained to identify entities, whether they be organizations or locations or people, in text. And so what it does is it uses those entity descriptions and fine-grained entity types to link in-text entities to corresponding Wikidata entries. And Wikidata is this huge corpus, sort of related to Wikipedia. We can see an example that's more closely resembles what we might expect to see in the text of an abstract, though this is a subset, like subtext from Wikipedia. So basically, we can see an example where in the text, we have a reference to Santis, which is a mountain in Switzerland. And so when we get a mention of Santis in the text, Refined, for example, would identify that that's an entity, and it would link it to the Wikidata entry for Santis. From that entry, we can link that entry, because it's a location, we can link it to geonames. So Wikidata entries all are linked to related geonames locations if they exist. Geonames is a much more fine-grained corpus of geographic entities that gives us a lot of more information, including differences between languages for how a location is referred to in text. So it's a really useful piece. Okay, so first, I think we were interested in sort of the author dataset country match over time. And so we can see that at the start of Nature Scientific Data, when it was founded in 2014, only about 40% of papers had at least one author whose country affiliation was the same as a location mentioned in the abstract of their dataset release. So that's not a lot of papers, right? Most of them were mismatches. But by 2023, we see that that's grown to approximately 77% of Nature Scientific Data papers that have at least one author whose country affiliation is the same as the data sample location. Now, what we were really interested in is what the sort of relationship is between sort of global north versus global south authors related to global south data sets, where we might see an example of sort of parachute science, where, you know, data is being used from the global south by global north researchers to further their research, but they're not properly perhaps citing or like giving recognition to global south researchers who are involved. And so what we can see here, though, is that at like a high level, what we're getting at here is that on papers using global south data, we found that global south researchers occupy only 35% of the leading positions on the paper, which is either first or last author on the paper. Our global indicators are essentially like how we divided countries up into global north, global south, and that's based on the Science and Technology Index ranking by Wagner et al. In 2015. And so the sort of like upper level science technology index rankings, upper half of the 4 are considered global north and the bottom 2 are considered global south. And so we can see that's a big difference. And then, so we also were interested in potentially what the topics might be for global south, like in terms of what global south authors are studying. When they're working on when they're leaders on papers with global south data. The most frequent concepts, which are essentially like keywords, kind of topics, just concepts generally from OpenAlex, which are associated with the paper, including geography, biology, and ecology for the most frequently referred to concepts in these papers. And the top fields of study of these papers include medicine, geography, and biology. So there are some interesting trends here that would be interesting to sort of look into in the future. In our future work, we hope to apply this to biobank dataset location extraction. So we've been able to access the geographic locations from biosamples on GeneBank But we can see that there's still, or it's possible that there is still some variance in the location names. So we'll pass them through refined and help to recreate this process with a much larger set of data. So thank you so much for your time. And